Okay, everyone, it's now 10:35, so that's a pretty good time to start. I just want to invite everybody who is not presenting today to turn off their microphones and turn off their cameras. It just helps us get the sort of flow right, and there's no interruptions with audio for this session, which is going to be recorded. For those of you who would like to access closed captions, you are able to go into the chat box, which everyone is invited to join. The chat box is over on the right-hand side at the top with a little speech bubble. And we've just put in the link to access the live captions. So there's a link there, and then there's the session ID there as well. Okay, so hopefully that's enough information now, and we'll make a start. Welcome to this 6th episode of Create Connects, Financial Planning and Organisational Health in Times of Crisis, and we're in one. We are all pretty aware of that. We have 3 wonderful guests joining us this morning from the arts and finance sector. David Sharpe, give us a wave, David. Lauren Hillier, who can't give us a wave because her camera is not functioning, and Vanessa Lloyd. Thanks, guys, for joining us. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that all of us are located somewhere on Aboriginal lands across this vast place we call New South Wales and Australia. And I live and work on Gadigal and Bidjigal lands, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. My name is Beck Dean. I'm a manager in arts funding and development at Create New South Wales, and there's 2 other Create New South Wales staff here lurking in the background, Merrily Ray and Ivana Jovanovic, who will help moderate your questions as we go, and you are most welcome to add questions into this chat box that we've got going. So at the moment we're going to be discussing finance in this situation. Everything from what is available in terms of packages from the various governments and how to access them, and what's actually suitable for arts organisations, through to sort of how to engage with financial planning on an organisational level. And then we're actually going to take a look at a case study with an organisation represented by Vanessa Lloyd today. So we're joined by management and business consultant David Sharpe from Sharpe Advisory, chartered accountant Lauren Hillier from Generate, and company manager Vanessa Lloyd from Performance Safe, or general manager or company manager, who'll talk about strategic and practical approaches to financial management. So what we're going to do is we have basically some presentations from and conversations with our guests this morning. So we're going to move between those 2 kinds of styles. If you can hold your questions till the end or put them into the chat box, we can actually feed those questions in to the conversations that we're having. So first I'm going to start with Lauren, who's joining us from a dark place at the moment, place without cameras. But his audio yeah, that's right. But his audio is pretty good. So Lauren, you're a chartered accountant. You've got a creative arts degree, and you work with creative industry clients across taxation and structuring and business planning. So you've got a pretty good idea of what's kind of happening on both sides of the Excel sheet. Can you talk us through the kinds of things that are available, financial support that's available at the moment to arts organisations?
Yeah, absolutely, Beck. So obviously we've been in the thick of it in the last couple of months. I've been referring to my team as the unsung frontline workers as we try and navigate through all of the grant options that are available for our creative clients, which is you guys as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is the sort of 3 batches of grant stimulus that has been announced. So at the ATO level, at the Revenue New South Wales level, and then the other level, which there's quite a few sort of quite specific grants that are lurking around. It's just about being able to find them. So I guess what we've experienced in the last couple of months is that the announcements came quite thick and fast with these new grants, and they didn't often have a lot of detail, and they were kind of made up on the fly. So that's one thing, if we're taking away from this, is to always check back in on them. If you didn't quite satisfy the criteria at the beginning, check again, because they have issued some clarification on different rules, different sort of options for getting more people to be eligible. So it's always worth checking in. So on an ATO level, the two main stimulus packages are JobKeeper and Cash Flow Boost. So Cash Flow Boost was the first one that came out. It's a mechanism where you can get between $20,000 and $100,000 in tax-free grant money, and it's for businesses that employ staff. So they have to be registered for PAYG withholding. So for you guys out there that are in organisations, this is for you. Probably not so much the sole traders, unless your sole trader business also employs staff. So it in particular is calculated from the PAYG withholding that's reported on your activity statements, so your IASs and your BASs, between the periods of March and September. So that March to September sort of time frame is a common theme. That sort of 6-month period tends to be how the government policy has been rolled out, that's sort of the period that they're looking at. And one thing we'll talk about later is, well, what happens when September comes and everything drops off a cliff, because that's a real concern across all businesses with this stimulus. So the cash flow boost, what do you need to do? You need to lodge your activity statements by the due date. So if you're lodging through a tax agent, that probably means tomorrow is your due date for the March activity statement. And that means that the payments will be made within a few weeks of lodgement of that activity statement. We have had a few issues around businesses that weren't in existence last year, where the ATO has been taking a little bit more time to process those, but there is some mechanisms for escalating those claims. So talk to your accountant if it hasn't landed. If you've lodged your BAS and it hasn't landed in your account yet, do get your accountant to give the ATO a bit of a hurry along, and they might need some extra information to be able to do that. The biggest one, I think, for our industries and most industries has been JobKeeper. So JobKeeper is basically to keep people out of the Centrelink line and keep people engaged with the businesses that they currently work for. It's been a big issue in our industries in that a lot of the criteria is that a lot of people have fallen out of the system. There is a lot of sort of lobbying at the moment to extend the system into, potentially casuals, potentially people on tourist on visas rather than permanent residents and citizens. Personally, I don't think that that's at this late stage going to happen, but I've been wrong before with some of the announcements that have come out about these various things. So it's, again, watch this space. Always keep on top of it, and even if you didn't qualify before, maybe you do now. So Cliff Notes of JobKeeper, it's the ATO administered wage subsidy for businesses that have experienced a turnover drop between comparing this time and this time last year. And you can look at a month, you can look at a quarter. There's a couple of different timeframes that you can look at that satisfies. So for most businesses, you need to have experienced a turnover drop of 30% or 15% for not-for-profits, which would be a number of you guys as well. It's $1,500 per employee per fortnight over the 6-month period from April to September. But it's mostly underway now, so probably a lot of you have already sort of ticked those boxes, put in your applications, and have started to see that money drop into your bank account, which I'm sure you're very, very grateful for. So as I said, the big issue is that it only covers full-time, part-time employees that were employed as at 1 March. That doesn't include if you had a contract signed before 1 March and they started after 1 March, which has been quite problematic with some of our clients as well. And it includes casuals that have worked for you systematically over a 12-month period. So quite often, casual workforce that a lot of our industries work with have fallen out of this system as a result. I guess the main thing that came about in sort of a bit of a second wave of the clarification of the rules of JobKeeper is the alternative tests. And I really think that's something that's worth looking at. If you thought that you didn't satisfy the criteria in the first instance, we had a whole bunch of clients that did satisfy when they released these additional tests, which were very, very welcomed. So this is for businesses that aren't particularly linear, so it's widening the net a little bit more. And it typically covers businesses that didn't exist last year. So it's like, well, how do I compare this year to last year if I wasn't actually around? There's a provision for that and a modified test. If you've restructured your business, so if you have got sort of wound a part of your business down, if you've acquired a different business, if you've merged businesses, there's some provisions around that. Businesses experiencing rapid growth have, they sort of put up their hand and said, well, we're being disadvantaged because we're doing really well and we're, absolutely smashing it. We're in that sort of, upswing of our business. What does that mean for us? There's a test for them. The main one, or main two really, that might qualify for you guys is businesses with lumpy income is what we're calling it. I'm pretty sure that's not the exact ATO term, but that's essentially where you don't have a regular income stream or a seasonality to your income stream that means that this time last year isn't necessarily reflective of what you're experiencing right now. It's a little bit finicky, the calculation, but talk to your accountant about it. But it essentially allows you to use an averaged method rather than just a linear this time versus this time. The other is sole traders, and it's just for sole traders who didn't work last year due to illness or leave or something that was out of their control. So there's a provision around that to expand a little bit more for sole traders. So I guess timeframes for this one, you have to have applied by the 31st of May if you want to qualify from the first fortnight. The thing with JobKeeper is that you can opt in at any stage. So often businesses won't necessarily have experienced a drop straight away, but then in that sort of flow-on effect, then they experience the drop later on. You can always apply for JobKeeper from whichever fortnight between now and September you satisfy the drop. So another one, keep an eye on that and really watch how your turnover's going, and it might mean that you even pick up 3 months of it in the back end. That will definitely help your cash flow. So that's on the ATO level, the two main stimulus packages. Given that we're a Create New South Wales discussion here, Revenue New South Wales is sort of the next tier down. So this is essentially state-based funding opportunities. And the two main ones that Revenue New South Wales are looking at are for people that are over the payroll tax threshold and under the payroll tax threshold. So over the payroll tax threshold, that means you've got wages of over 900,000 in the year. They're offering a 25% reduction in payroll tax for FY 2020. You can defer payments until October 2020. Key word there being defer, and we'll talk about that as well. And increasing the threshold to $1 million in payroll from the 1st of July in sort of 6 weeks' time. The one that has really been fantastic for a lot of our clients and probably you guys is the small business grant that Revenue New South Wales is offering. It's a $10,000 grant to cover overhead expenses that you have to continue to pay, whether that's rent or staff that aren't eligible for JobKeeper or utilities or that kind of thing. It requires an income drop of 75% for a 2-week period. So these are really for businesses that just, once that public health order came in that says no movement, stay at home, where their business income pretty much just stopped. So musicians that can't tour anymore, venues that can't open, all that kind of stuff, this is really the grant for you. So there is a list of highly impacted industries. If you're not on that list, you can still be eligible. You just have to talk to your accountant about it. So arts and recreation, museums, zoos, gardens, performing arts, venues, that all of those people are able to access this. You have to have had at least one employee. So that's just one thing that a few people have missed, that particular requirement. So it's between 1 and 20 employees that you've had to have on your books to qualify for that one. It's only open for another week, so do retest to see. It's a 2-week period. Anytime from the 30th of March onwards, you can do a match of any 2-week period that would get you over the line. So again, even if you didn't qualify for the first couple of weeks of April, retest and see what these last 2 weeks look like compared to this time last year. So that's on a Revenue New South Wales level. There are some industry-specific and regional grants. I won't go through them here, but you need to be looking at the lovely people at Create New South Wales, the Australia Council, City of Sydney is doing a whole tranche of things. Just depending on where you are, there's little bits and pieces. So, you know, by the time you get, you know, a little bit of all of these different grants, and a lot of them, they don't exclude, if you get one, it doesn't exclude you from applying for others. So, you know, put your finger in as many pies as you can, I would suggest, to help you get through this. So that's sort of...
I did want to ask you a question, actually, just before I forget the term lumpy income, which I think is a really great term that sort of covers off a lot of artistic practitioners, I guess, who are sole traders. And some of the, you know, and I think absolutely early on in the JobKeeper sort of application process, I think people were finding that reporting quite difficult to navigate, because sometimes they're, you know, artists have an enormous, not an enormous, but relatively enormous amount of income coming in and later in the year, and then nothing at the start of the year. So, I mean, given the fact that there are still 6 days to apply for this for JobSeeker, I think it is important to let you know, for those of you who are joining us today, know that that is an availability to artists who are sole traders, and that there is just a little bit of that accounting reporting that you kind of need to do to sort of get you over the line. Lauren, do you have any tips for perhaps for artists that don't have the services of an accountant to get through JobKeeper, or would you suggest that they do?
Yeah, look, it is the kind of thing that you can administer it yourself. It is a self-assessment system, like a lot of the ATO requirements are. So if you assess that you qualify, then you can apply. You don't have to sort of submit your, you know, documents to the ATO to show how you got to that assessment. But in any ATO self-assessment situation, if they were to come back and audit you, you would need those documents as to how you got to that. It's a calculation. On the ATO website is some pretty clear guidelines on how you do that calculation. So it's about having all of your documents all ready and income from the last 12 months, and yeah, it's just working through those calculations. So give it a crack.
Yeah, that's I think it's a really I have heard some success stories from artists on JobKeeper, so I'm just kind of really keen that people know that they can apply to that.
Absolutely, and it's also that thing of the 31st of March is if you want to qualify from the first fortnight. That doesn't discount you from opting into the system later on and getting it for whatever the remaining period of JobKeeper is. You only have to qualify once, so don't be worried about, you know, well, what happens if my income does have an upswing, which would be great. Once you're in the system, you're in the system, and you definitely get it for the remaining period. So don't be worried about that.
Great, that's great knowledge, Lauren. Thank you so much. So people, remember, you can apply. I think maybe now because we're sort of short on time, we might move straight to David. So David, thank you for joining us today. You specialise in creative digital industries companies. focusing on assisting them to identify and pursue opportunities for growth. Obviously, growth is somewhat stymied at the moment. So you've wonderfully prepared a presentation on this topic. So I'll just let you take it away. Thank you, David.
Okay, just thanks, Beck, and just double checking you can see the presentation and you can hear me okay?
That's a thumbs up from me. Oh, now
Oh,
we
good,
can't
okay.
see it. Now we can't see it.
Okay, hang on for a minute. Coming back
Sometimes
to try this once more.
It takes a few seconds to connect. Here we go. You're right. Take it away.
Great, thank you very much. So, yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I'm just going to run you through a few things today which I think is relevant to this conversation, and sort of flowing on from Lauren's overview of the sort of assistance which is available to you. I want to talk about what the outlook is for the next 6 to 12 months as we start to see restrictions around public gathering being lifted. I've got a few tips for individuals and a few tips for organisations, some suggestions around specific financial measures, and then also I've got a list of resources which I think is useful for you to access at this time. So we're moving from a period, I think, where the mitigation strategies are coming to an end. The government stimulus packages are coming to an end. And we're starting to move into a period where we need to prepare for the eventual recovery. And in New South Wales, we're starting to see some of the restrictions around public gathering lifted. And that's been a real difficulty for anyone in live events or performance in particular. Also in the visual arts, to be able to sort of continue operations. So one of the main challenges in the next 6 months is working out how social distancing is going to work for your particular art form, and how you can continue operations and continue to generate revenue with smaller amounts of people. The second longer term challenge is around the hit the economy has taken. I've been recently looking at some data showing how deep this recession is going to be, and it certainly dwarfs the global financial crisis by some magnitude. So inevitably, disposable income from consumers is going to be hit. And what all this means is that you guys have been in crisis management now for the last couple of months. And I think that crisis management is going to continue for the rest of the year. And that makes strategic planning really difficult. It's very difficult to plan effectively when you're trying to manage a crisis. And so short-term planning becomes much more the focus than kind of long-term planning for all of you. But people have been locked inside their houses for a long time, and they will be eager to sample and support the arts. So there is that consumer demand to factor in. I just wanted to briefly talk about a few of the challenges and contradictions that I think this outlook is presenting, and these are sort of things I think you should be considering when thinking about what your next 12 to 18 months looks like. I've said there that live is going to become a premium experience. So smaller amounts of people, more bespoke experiences, potentially higher ticket prices per person. But at the same time, how does that work when disposable income is falling and people don't necessarily have the amount of money to spend? Another contradiction is that we've seen a lot of digital innovation in this time, seen arts companies putting their product online in lots of different ways, but a lot of it's been going out for free. And that's a problem, I think, not only because it doesn't generate revenue, but because it sets a sort of price signal in the consumer's mind about how they should be able to access and what price they should pay for arts content. Traditionally, a lot of arts projects have had long lead times and been delivered to many, large-scale experiences delivered to a lot of people at once. I think that that's going to turn around and we're going to need to see quick, repeatable experiences for small groups and fast, changeable programming. So this is really a challenge to how performing arts, visual arts, all community arts all across the spectrum has been planned and delivered in the past. let me just give you a few tips for individuals, and because I know we've got lots of individual artists on here today, and then I'll talk about the organisations. For individual artists, your first thing you should be doing is mobilising your customer base, looking after your past clients and network and customers, having your database ready, be communicating to them often, talking to them about what you're doing, keeping them close. Know the online platforms which are available for monetising digital experiences. Do a bit of research. Find out which ones will only allow people to view stuff if they're paying a ticket price. Those are the ones you should be leaning towards. One thing we've seen in the last few months is that private tuition has been one of the easiest parts of arts practice to monetise online. So musicians, dance teachers, visual arts teachers have been able to transfer their live experience to a digital experience, and tuition has been something that people are finding easy to pay for. As I noted before, look, as the restrictions lift gradually, think about premium experiences you can create for small numbers of people. And also create work for COVID-safe spaces. And I think this is a real challenge, particularly for theatre organisations, because, well, for theatre artists really thinking about where to stage their spaces. Even if you've got a low number of people in a theatre, that doesn't necessarily make it financially sustainable. And then what about all those other spaces like foyers and car parks and toilets? I think for individual artists, be thinking about how you can pivot your art form to be performed in spaces you wouldn't normally perform in, but you know that where social distancing can be maintained and where people can feel safe about attending. For arts organisations, firstly, and many of you may already have done this, assemble a team of people around you. You're going to need a team of staff and board, a small group, a working group who can help you navigate through this crisis as it rolls on, because it's not over yet. It's going to go for another 6 to 12 months. You'll have need and support around you if you've got that core team. Many organisations will be struggling with how to operate with low numbers of patrons. And inevitably, I write this second point with a little bit of a heavy heart, that inevitably for some organisations, you'll have to hibernate and plan for the recovery if there's just no financial model which allows you to generate revenue from your attendees. But for organisations which can ramp up as restrictions ease, and I'm particularly thinking of visual arts organisations and galleries here, create bespoke, quick, memorable experiences for people, because likely people are going to feel nervous about attending. They maybe not want to spend as long in your venues as they wanted to in the past. So think about how you can make them memorable experiences which they'll talk about to their friends, which will share online, but which are also quick and convenient for them. Plan projects which are easily converted to digital experiences. And this is really a business continuity strategy in case there's a second wave. And I think that really in the long term, we'll all be looking for effective digital backup plans, I think, for arts projects. And finally, stay connected to your donor base. And your end of financial year campaigns should already be well advanced, seeing as it's nearly June. But certainly this is going to be a critical time for those of you running those campaigns. There's going to be added focus on them. A few financial must-haves, I think. Cash flow planning is essential at this time. You've got to have a cash flow budget. You've got to be monitoring it on a week-by-week or month-by-month basis. So work with your treasurers or your financial staff, or create your own if you're an individual, so that you can plan that out. A lot of organisations I'm talking to are taking this as an opportunity to cut their expenses. Some of them are looking at this and going, wow, I finally had to bite the bullet on this thing I was never really brave enough to cut. While others are going, here's this thing I've always wanted to cut and I've never quite had an excuse to do it. So there's a range of different approaches to cutting your expenses there. Retain staff where you can, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's also cheaper than rehiring eventually. It's just a good financial strategy. As we're in crisis mode, a lot of you, particularly organisations, will be spending your reserves on overhead expenses like salaries and rent, and that's completely understandable. But don't neglect funding revenue-generating activities where you can find them. Like, they are good investments of your reserves money. And use this time to strengthen your donor campaign. And I'm using donors, not sponsors here. It's going to be a very difficult market for business sponsorship in the short term. So think about your donors and your philanthropic foundations more. And just in general, here's something I think everyone should be thinking of as a general principle. Firstly, work out how much money you're going to need to trade through, and then work out how you're going to get it. So I give the example of an organisation I've been working with who came to me and said, we've already cut everyone down to 4 days a week. And my response was, well, did you need to do that? Or do you need to do more than that? How do we know unless we know exactly what the financial impost is over the next few months? I just want to very quickly run through some resources I would recommend that everyone looks at. A company called Pattern Makers has just last week put out a survey results from their Audience Outlook Monitor, giving a real insight into how audiences are preparing to return to arts events and what their concerns are and what their approaches are. It's a really extensive set of data, and I think you should go and take a browse through it. On the Australia Council site, there's 2 guides which I've written. There's a guide to government COVID assistance, which is getting up to its 8th edition and getting exceedingly thin, but it's still up there, and some FAQs on JobKeeper. So that's 2 easy documents, which we hope are quite user-friendly. For individual artists in particular, if you don't know about the Australian Cultural Fund, go and have a look at it. It's a crowdfunding platform which allows you to offer tax-deductible donations. Also good for organisations who don't have gift deductible status. For organisations, don't forget that the federal government has an SME guarantee scheme for loans for working capital. Which includes a kind of a working repayments holiday and then low interest rates moving forward, worth having a look at. There's also a COVID-19 national funding platform set up by Philanthropy Australia, which is helping match potential philanthropic funders with projects. A kind of you put up your project, it gets some due diligence behind it, and then it gets loaded up, and philanthropic funders can look through for opportunities to help funding there. So that's a useful one. And finally, another document I had some input into, the Create New South Wales Creating Income Generation Toolkit, is a really extensive resource of tips and trips around how to generate private income from donations and sponsorship and a range of other things. All of those links I've sent through to Marilee, and she'll make sure that they're either on the chat channel or they get out to you in some other way. So just my last slide, keep the recovery in mind because it will come. We just don't know the speed at which it's going to come, and we don't know the climb outward. We don't know what that rate is going to look like for arts organisations. But we can be sure that audiences will be hungry for live experiences after the lockdown, but they won't have the disposable income you thought they had in the past, and they'll be concerned for their safety. Not just being at the space, but also if you're a venue which relies on public transport to get attendees to and from, they're going to be concerned about using that too. So your challenge, I guess, is to respond to those new demands from your attendees as they move forward. That's the end of my presentation. I'll stop sharing my screen and come back to you.
Thanks so much for that, David. It's some really interesting observations and tips and processes that people, organisations and artists can go through, which is really important at the moment. I think planning first rather than sort of jumping to conclusions, I guess, is really good advice. I did want to ask you some questions on the philanthropy front. Actually, just whether you're observing whether that is still, I guess that sort of issue with recession and people with large amounts of money invested in various things, whether philanthropists will start to pull back their support for the arts. I have heard some very heartwarming stories actually from clients about philanthropists staying in the game with them, which is very exciting to hear. What is your sort of, you know, from a broader, probably more of a global perspective, and what's happening on that front with the arts?
Well, the important factor here is the strength of your relationship with those donors. So really the key to success here has actually been 1, 2, 3 years in the past by now. The stronger your relationships with your existing donors, the more likely they're going to stick with you at this time. So those donations are going to come in many forms. So many organisations have had to cancel their subscription series, and they've asked their donors to convert that to donations. And from what I hear, it's getting about a 10 to 25% success rate. So that's a starting point for a lot of people to build on. All right, so if those people are prepared to give, what else might they be able to prepare to support? There will be more demand on the philanthropy sort of industry as a whole, like those foundations and trusts. Competition will rise from those. But think about the demographics of your existing donor base, and you know, and to what extent they're going to be impacted by this. It might be that if you've got a set of older philanthropists who are self-funded retirees, or if you've got people who may be not as exposed to this, they might be able to step up. So you might be looking for specific campaigns or specific requests targeted at groups of your donor base.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks for that. And moving on to Vanessa, who's going to kind of, I guess, talk about the actual, you know, David's taken us through some obviously some tested kind of theory, but let's have a look at these sorts of ideas in practice. And we're talking with Vanessa, who works with Performance Space and is leading them through this financial situation. Vanessa, do you want to talk with us about your approach to the COVID-19 crisis, and I guess where you're at now, and what you're sort of thinking about for the future?
Yeah, sure. It's such a strange time. It seems, I was looking back at dates, it's actually not that long ago, yet it seems like forever ago, and yet also like yesterday. So it's I guess it's that thing of having to respond and then respond again sometimes, and keep that moving. Just so people know, Performance Space, we're actually quite a small core team. We're only sort of 6 staff for full-time year-round, and we actually grow because we have our LiveWorks Festival at the end of the year, so we can be quite nimble, I guess, which was useful. So our first sort of priority was we met with our board, our Risk and Governance Committee, in the middle of March, and made a pretty quick call that we should be working from home, developed a policy around that, which I think most of us are doing now, and you know, within a couple of days, people with their, you know, their Mac and their office chair left Carriageworks, our home, and we've been there ever since. I guess we set up a few very quick things just to sort of check in with the team and to make sure everyone was working and happy. Those things are just really simple stuff, like a daily whip. Every couple of weeks we have a sort of a set aside time just to check in with everyone about how they're working from home, and just acknowledging that everyone's situation is different as well. Some of us have a second bedroom like I do here, so others are at a kitchen table in a share house, and just sort of checking in and monitoring those things and making sure people have access to both mental health options as well as physical sort of options to make sure they're happy and safe. That was our very first priority, I guess, and it's one that's ongoing, and we'll continue to check in with everybody. I think the second thing, and especially for me as general manager, was just to check the numbers to make sure, you know, we knew numbers would be down, we knew the budget would be, our targets were that we had just sort of happily set in place for 2020 were not going to happen, but just to make sure that we were still going to be okay. Thankfully, P-Space is down but not out. So I guess then the next thing was just to step into that next phase. What does 2020 look like? In the first few weeks, it was very cab rank, I guess, first cab off the rank. We have obviously our big festival in October, so we had some breathing room there, but we have residencies. We were co-presenting a festival in Austin, Texas, and various other things over the first few weeks of COVID that we really had to just jump on and see what could happen, how could happen, and most especially supporting our artists to make sure that even if there were things had shifted and changed, that they still had support and funding where possible. That was sort of the first few weeks, I guess, for us. Those priorities probably haven't changed a whole heap. I guess it's the team, it's the artists, it's, you know, just going back and forth to see what 2020 and 2021 now will look like for us, what can happen, what needs to happen differently. And I guess I've also become a JobKeeper specialist, and obviously there's been other curveballs thrown our way with Carriageworks going into voluntary administration and things like that. So it's just those flow-on effects of figuring out what we need to do this week to keep things moving and to keep focused on what our priorities are. Yeah.
And so have you has your board, I know that there's a lot of the questions that I'm asking are kind of like, oh, a bit sort of within the cone of silence of the board potentially, but have you been working with your board to sort of come together and actually like develop a group that can support you and the staff?
I will say, David, having a COVID response specific task force, we have not named it that, and I suppose we've worked both with the board as a bigger group on a number of sort of, you know, big discussions, but we also work with we have a number of subcommittees. So we have a risk and governance subcommittee, and we have a finance and audit subcommittee, and a development subcommittee, which deals with a lot of our philanthropy and sponsorships and all that kind of stuff. So we've sort of gone to them separately for the sort of more granular discussions, I guess, to make sure that we're developing policy or realigning targets or things like that. I guess, yeah, the board's been really active, and it is a time, I think, when organisations should be leaning on their boards, that they've got expertise, they're also out in other sectors and got their ear to different information than we have. So they've been really great. I guess the other thing is, I mean, I'm leaning on anybody I can at this point. So I think just sharing information even amongst other general managers and organisations. The KO network's been really strong and has been meeting once a fortnight. The KO group is a group of arts organisations around Australia, mostly visual arts organisations that Peacebase is a part of. So that connection has been quite strong as well. And I mean, and calling on people like our accountant and things like that too, who work across arts organisations across New South Wales. So I think it's one of those call a friend moments, definitely. Yeah, and our board has definitely been really strong. Yeah.
Now, Performance Space is a multi-year funded client with the Australia Council, and you're presently a multi-year funded client with Create New South Wales as well. Both funding agencies were requesting 4-year plans from you, which basically the Create New South Wales one was submitted, and then it was practically the day after we kind of went into lockdown. So obviously that's an enormous amount of time and energy working on, I guess, strategy that is now profoundly impacted by the pandemic and the situation that we're in. How are you coping with that change, and I guess thinking about strategy with uncertainty as its foundation?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, and I mean, some things don't change, I guess. We're committed to certain kinds of work and certain kinds of artists, and thankfully they're experimental and hopefully up for a challenge, as we are, to think differently about how we present work. We deal with experimental performance, but it's such a wide gamut, I guess, where there are some, I mean, exciting is not quite the right word to use at the moment, but hopefully some challenges turned into opportunities, I guess, in how we work and how we present work and how we work with artists. In terms of the specifics of what that looks like, it's scenario time, I've got to say. We've got so many different versions of things sort of in the sky. For 2020, we've sort of locked down a few things, but it still is very much based on, and I think David touched on this as well, any kind of gathering, no kind of gathering, large kind of gathering. I think we're all aware Day for Night with 1,000 people dancing away in Bay 17 is not going to happen this year, but it doesn't mean that Day for Night in some way or shape or form can't happen this year. So I think we're it does feel a little bit Groundhog Day-ish in terms of, I mean, not that one ever writes a strategy and then puts it on the shelf and never looks at it again, but it felt like we'd sort of tackled a few big questions for the next few years for Peacebase, and now we're sort of thinking about what they mean. I guess the essence of them we hope to maintain, which is the way that we work with artists and support and are a leader in the sector, but how those things happen is really the variable, especially as we have spent the last few years working quite tirelessly, Jeff, our artistic director, on many planes over many hours, building up networks in the Asia Pacific region, which has been really successful. We've got amazing partnerships and amazing contacts with artists and things like that. And what that's going to look like, I think, is definitely a big question for Peace Space. But we're super committed to making that engagement work. And I think that's where the digital for us comes into play even more so than maybe for some other organisations, just so we keep those connections strong and those markets growing for our artists, and working with that so that it does become something engaging digitally as well. I think there is a worry of just putting things up online and putting them up for free. David, thank you for saying that, because I totally agree. That is a slightly worrying trend, I think, in the arts, and hopefully it was just a crisis response moment that we can hopefully move into really pithy and purposeful use of technology, I guess, going forward.
Yeah, I think I mean, performance spaces, actually, because you've tried so many different ways of actually, with your artists, working with audiences, from very small one-on-one kinds of engagements to, you know, exclusive kind of group projects. You actually understand the economies of those things as well, and what you actually need to do to sort of turn them into something that generates a revenue, which is actually really you're kind of on the front foot in that, in terms of live performance. So wish you all the very best with that work as you go into the future and try to juggle the uncertainty of this situation. I wanted to ask you guys, before we open this conversation out to the chat and to the people that have joined us today, thank you very much, everyone. Do you guys have any questions for each other, or things that you would like to ask across these sort of, you know, conceptual, theoretical, practical kind of engagement with finance and the future? Maybe I will now turn this over. I'll turn this over to the chat. So for those of you online, maybe you're artists, maybe you're running organisations, we have 3 incredibly amazing people here. If you'd like to ask them a specific question, you're more than welcome also to chime in on your microphone at this point. If you'd like to ask a question of any of us, we're more than happy to help you.
Yeah, because a few of the things that David touched on, which I would definitely agree with, is, you know, this need to think in the immediate and the long term concurrently. You know, you're in crisis mode, but you've also got to think think ahead, because September will come around quite quickly, and, you know, we're going to need to operate in our industries in a limited capacity for quite some time. So, you know, being financially conservative for that period is super important, and, you know, planning cash flow in reverse. You know, how much do you need and how are you going to get it, I think is a really important piece of advice.
Yeah, and I think people's plans for 2021 are going to have to be so fluid. It's really, and this is something for the funding bodies and the arts organisations and the artists to all have a conversation about what level of planning rigour you're expecting over the next 18 months. It would be interesting if we can get to a place where everyone is very relaxed, really, about the plans moving forward, and maybe you only have like 3 to 4 months certainty in front of you, and everything after that is allowed to be a little bit more blurry. It's a challenge for boards too, actually.
Yeah, it's such an interesting dynamic, because I remember even in March, when this sort of first kind of started to hit us, we were thinking of this kind of this issue where we would have this kind of problem, and then the problem would go away. And now I think that has absolutely changed. Like, our thinking around all of those things has absolutely changed. So we're actually thinking of a change paradigm rather than situation normal. And so I think, yes, very much all of us at Create New South Wales are working with our clients to sort of stabilise, to help to stabilise with the funding that we've supported them with, the company as it stands now in this particular moment. But we were also very conscious of having to, you know, work towards future possibilities with all of our clients, and to understand what that means for the broader sector, from artists to sort of major performing arts organisations. And it means very different things to everyone as well.
And maybe just one further thought before people jump in with questions is that for organisations based in Sydney, now's a great time actually to be thinking about partnerships with regional organisations. These regional areas are actually, there's a lot of evidence to say that after the GFC in the cultural economies, regional organisations bounce back faster than those in the cities. And also you think about different types of spaces, different types of ways of doing social distancing might be easier in some of those regional places. So it's time to talk to your colleagues out in the regions, I reckon.
And it's definitely, you know, because we don't even know what the future of international travel is going to look like, where we do, as Vanessa said, you know, Performance Space has spent a long time working in Southeast Asia, working to sort of develop relationships there with likewise kind of organisations, and perhaps that is a relationship that might have to be put on hold for a few years, or to be figured out in different ways. But the idea of local is coming up much more in the conversations that I'm having with organisations, in terms of collaborating, you know, within the context of Western Sydney organisations collaborating together, and then actually sending stuff out into the regions, or collaborating with regional organisations. So it's definitely coming up, these ideas to make those cultural connections stronger in a local context.
And collaborating with tourism as well, and, you know, sort of, that sort of cross partnerships, not just within the arts organisation, the arts industries, but, you know, sort of trying to figure who you can partner with in an Australian context, so that you can have some mutually beneficial sort of programs that might suit them as well.
Yes, because we do know and understand that the arts bring livability to contexts, and these are things that regional arts organisations really need to be showing their value to their local councils that support them, and sort of really showing that understanding and benefiting from that value, I think, at this time. I think we don't have any questions from our very quiet group of participants today. There's a lot of...
Beck, I can see one there which is saying, what are the gaps in funding you are seeing at the moment for the arts? It's in the chat channel.
Oh, have I missed something? Right, so I'm just going to have a look up there, see if I can find it. Maybe David, I can't find that one. So maybe if you could answer that, that'd be have a go at answering that. That'd be great. I'll try and find it.
So the gaps in the funding at the moment, obviously the major one is around excluding individual freelance workers from JobKeeper, and to my mind, it shows a real lack of understanding of how employment works in those areas. And in particular, two industries in particular, screen and performing arts. They're the ones really where there's most of those freelancers going from job to job, and the structures around them mean they're short-term employees. I think we need to get much better at telling that story, and we need to have better data about exactly how many people there are in those industries. Somebody asked me that recently, and it said that data actually doesn't really exist. And so I think we need to be able to tell that story a little bit better next time around.
Yeah, telling a better story about the value of art and artists, I think, is one of the things that's really coming up a lot at the moment. And actually, the disunity in the arts actually needs to be addressed, and we all kind of need to come together to start to cooperate in a better way for everyone. Oh, Sarah Parsons says, good point about the regional orgs. We have found that being not fee for service and a project-based org with multi-year funding state only, because we're based in a remote regional area, means we can use this time to consolidate and future plan our day-to-day operations have been able to continue, albeit in a different format. And Sarah's from Outback Theatre in Deniliquin. Thanks, Sarah. It's really great to hear from you. And yeah, I hope that you are able to sort of emerge from this situation for the future, and also to be able to communicate that value to your regional council area. Yeah.
Yeah, our client base, we're seeing that a lot as well. You know, sort of individuals doing a lot more sort of life admin while they've got a bit of time on their hands, but also businesses really having a look at, well, what was on my one day or to-do list in terms of, you know, tightening up a particular part of the business, or yeah, installing a new software system, or, you know, just sort of what are those things that you never quite got around to doing because your head was always in the product and the actual service, you know, focusing on your own business and looking internally for a little while.
There's a question from Tara Callahan. David, you mentioned that the COVID could be worse for the economy than the GFC. Is there any long-term projection about how these economic problems will affect the arts? Will people stop spending, or no data yet?
No data yet, but the critical difference between the two, there's two critical differences between the two things as far as I can see. Firstly, this downturn dwarfs the GFC. It's much, much bigger than that blip in 2008. And secondly, this one was caused by government restrictions, whereas the other one was caused by a financial market blip. So this one was caused by government. They can turn off those restrictions when they want. But there's a public health element to this one as well. There's a real uncertainty about how people are going to behave in a post-COVID world. Whereas after the GFC, we sort of saw people spring back to normal behaviour as soon as they could. So the great unknown for the arts really is how attendees and audiences are going to respond. And just again mention that Pattern Makers survey. That's the first real data we've got. Now, obviously, what people say they're going to do and what they actually do are often two very different things. But at least we have a starting point for thinking about how audiences and attendees are going to behave. And I think everyone should start reading that data and have a look at it.
And Tara just says she's from Broken Hill. Hi, Tara. Yes, and we do want to see a lot more engagement with regional organisations from urban organisations. So hoping that this might drive some new collaborations and experimentation across New South Wales, which would be really wonderful. I think we've come to the end of our questions for this session now. I just want to thank you all for joining us today and sharing that expertise across all these different vectors, I guess, that people have to navigate now. And this idea of being kind of nimble and prepared for the future is something that definitely resonates from these conversations, in sort of keeping all of your options quite open. And that will mean a lot of shifting in processes and methods that arts organisations have to work in the future. So thank you. I'd like to, this is the last of our Create Connect series. However, we're probably going to start doing a few more, because as you know, there was an announcement on the weekend. It's likely that we'll need to do a lot more webinaring around those announcements. We also had an announcement last week about the reopening of art galleries, and so we are going to be doing a webinar that addresses your issues and concerns as gallery managers, as people who run exhibition spaces, how you get to that point of reopening, and giving you some practical advice around that. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Stay safe and well, and hope to see you on the other side in person in a foyer somewhere. Okay, bye.